How does a continent fall apart and then reinvent itself? In just a few centuries, Western Europe went from the glory of Roman emperors to a shattered world of warlords, wooden castles, and collapsing cities. And yet out of that chaos came something extraordinary, a new civilization built on the bones of the old. This is not just the story of kings and popes, of knights and castles. It's the story of how faith, warfare, culture, and innovation transformed a dying empire into the foundation of the modern world. From Romans to Christians, from barbarians to emperors reborn, this is the epic story of how Europe was born. Before we go deeper, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you don't miss a future upload. Alright, let's keep going. In the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, the Roman Empire dominated the European continent and the Mediterranean world. Its borders stretched from the cold highlands of Britannia to the sun-drenched deserts of Egypt, and from the Atlantic coasts of Hispania to the lush green valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates. At the heart of this immense empire was a political and military system built for stability, economic prosperity, and cultural integration. This period of stability was known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Rome's roads connected distant provinces. Its aqueducts brought fresh water to massive cities. Its legions kept internal rebellion and external threats at bay. And its law, language, and customs wove together the diverse peoples of the empire into something resembling unity. But as Rome flourished, something new began to grow on its eastern fringes. In the Roman province of Judea, a new faith emerged. Christianity, born from Jewish roots, preached a message of humility, redemption, and salvation. Radically different from the traditional Roman religions. It spread slowly at first, persecuted by the state. But over time, it won hearts, minds, and eventually emperors. By the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. By the end of the century, it had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. But while Christianity was gaining ground, Rome was beginning to lose it. The 3rd and 4th centuries saw crisis after crisis. Economic inflation, devastating plagues, food shortages, and invasions from external tribes. It became clear that ruling such a vast territory from a single capital was no longer viable. In 395 CE, the Roman Empire was permanently split into 2. A Western Empire, ruled from Rome, and an Eastern Empire, ruled from Constantinople, the city now known as Istanbul. The Eastern Roman Empire, later called the Byzantine Empire, was rich, urbanized, and resilient. The Western Empire, on the other hand, was agrarian, militarily weaker, and politically fragmented. And soon, its borders would begin to collapse. Across the Rhine and Danube rivers, Germanic tribes, long labeled as barbarians by the Romans, were migrating. These were not wild savages, but structured societies with their own kings, traditions, and warrior elites. Pressed by the westward expansion of the Huns and lured by the wealth of Roman lands, tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks pushed into Roman territory. Initially allowed in as foederati, allied peoples who served Rome in exchange for land, many of these groups eventually turned against their hosts. Rome no longer had the military or economic strength to resist. In 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. Although the child emperor held no real power, his removal is seen as the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire. From the fusion of Romans, Christians, and so-called barbarians, a new world would emerge, a world we now call medieval Europe. By the beginning of the 6th century, Europe had become a patchwork of newly founded barbarian kingdoms. The Ostrogoths ruled in Italy, preserving some Roman traditions. The Visigoths controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. In Gaul, the Franks, under their ambitious King Clovis, established a growing Christian kingdom. The Anglo-Saxons had carved up Britain into several competing realms. What united many of these emerging kingdoms was their slow but steady adoption of Christianity. Conversion to the faith of Rome was often politically motivated, offering legitimacy in the eyes of the local Roman populations and the Church. However, while Christianity and the memory of Rome lingered, the infrastructure of empire had crumbled. Roman roads and bridges fell into disrepair. Trade networks collapsed. Gold and silver coinage disappeared, replaced by a barter economy. With no money, standing armies became impossible. Most cities shrank dramatically or were abandoned altogether, Literacy, once widespread among Roman elites, dwindled to near extinction in the West. Education systems collapsed. The scribes who preserved knowledge were now monks, working by candlelight in isolated monasteries. In this vacuum of authority, power became local and personal. Loyalty was no longer to a state, but to a lord. Language fragmented. The Latin once spoken across the empire splintered into early forms of Spanish, French, and Italian. Though these new kingdoms claimed the legacy of Rome, they lacked its ability to administer and unify. For centuries, Western Europe would remain politically fragmented and economically stagnant, a sharp contrast to the still vibrant Byzantine Empire in the east and a rapidly rising force in the south. In the 6th century, one man dared to dream of restoring the old Roman glory. Justinian I, Emperor of Byzantium. Launching an ambitious campaign, Justinian sent his general Belisarius westward. North Africa was retaken from the Vandals. Italy was wrestled from the Ostrogoths in a grueling war. For a brief moment, it seemed the Mediterranean might once again be a Roman lake. But the cost was catastrophic. Cities were destroyed, populations were displaced, and before the dust could settle, new enemies appeared. The Lombards invaded northern Italy, ending Byzantine hopes of lasting control. Then, an even greater shift began. In the 7th century, a new power emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, Islam. Within a few decades, Arab Muslim armies swept across the Middle East and North Africa, conquering lands once held by both Rome and Persia. By 711 CE, they crossed into Spain and defeated the Visigothic kingdom. By the early 8th century, the Western Christian world appeared fragile, isolated between two powerful neighbors, the Byzantine Empire to the east and the Islamic Caliphate to the south. But on the fields of central France, in 732, the tide turned. At the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel, leader of the Franks, decisively defeated a Muslim army advancing northward. This victory not only halted Islamic expansion into Western Europe, but also set the stage for a new dynasty, one that would shape the continent's future. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, took the bold step of overthrowing the Merovingian king and claiming the Frankish throne for himself. In return for defending the Pope against the Lombards, he was anointed by the Church, a sacred fusion of religious and royal power. His son, Charles, later known as Charlemagne, would become one of the most significant figures in European history. Between 768 and 814, Charlemagne embarked on relentless military campaigns. He subdued the Saxons in the north, defeated the Lombards in Italy, and pushed into Muslim Spain. By the time of his death, he ruled most of Western and Central Europe. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans in St. Peter's Basilica. It was a symbolic act. Rome had a Western emperor once more. But this was not a revival of the Roman Empire as it once was. It was something new, a Christian empire, built not on cities and commerce, but on land, loyalty, and faith. Charlemagne also oversaw a cultural revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Monasteries were tasked with copying ancient manuscripts. Latin literacy was promoted. Art, architecture, and learning slowly began to flourish again. His empire laid the foundation for medieval European institutions, feudal relationships, the idea of Christian kingship, and a shared cultural identity that would endure long after the Carolingians themselves faded from power. Charlemagne's empire was impressive, but it was not built to last. When he died in 814, the unity he had forged began to unravel. His son Louis the Pious inherited the throne, but upon Louis's death, his three sons divided the empire among themselves in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. This treaty created three distinct regions: West Francia, which would eventually evolve into France, East Francia, the foundation of modern-day Germany, and a central strip that stretched from the Netherlands to Italy. This central kingdom, Lotharingia, was geopolitically unstable and contested. It would soon fragment further, becoming the battleground of medieval Europe for centuries to come. But the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire was not just internal. New waves of external attacks struck like a thunderstorm. From the north, Viking raiders emerged, master sailors from Scandinavia who targeted coastal cities, river towns, and monasteries. They looted, burned, and even settled. Paris was besieged, London was sacked, no coastline was safe. From the east, the Magyars, a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppes, launched devastating raids deep into Central Europe. Riding swift horses and using terrifying mobility, they left destruction in their wake, only to disappear before royal armies could respond. From the south, Muslim raiders attacked the Mediterranean coasts of France and Italy, pillaging Christian cities and establishing pirate strongholds. These relentless attacks exposed the fatal weakness of post-Carolingian Europe, the lack of central authority. Kings were powerless. The infrastructure of empire, roads, taxation, and professional armies, was gone. In this chaos, a new system began to take shape, one that would define European life for centuries. As central power collapsed, local lords stepped into the vacuum. The 9th and 10th centuries saw Europe become a continent of castles. Not grand stone fortresses at first, but wooden strongholds built quickly to defend against raiders. Each lord built their own walls, raised their own troops, and controlled their own territory. From these fortified manors, they ruled with near-total autonomy. Peasants seeking protection submitted themselves to the local lord's authority, trading freedom for safety. This arrangement formed the backbone of the feudal system. Power was not centralized in a capital, but dispersed across thousands of local rulers who pledged loyalty to a king, but often acted independently. At the heart of this system was vassalage. A nobleman would grant land, a fief, to another in exchange for loyalty and military service. This created a vast network of personal obligations where everyone owed someone, and no one could claim total authority, not even the king. Feudalism was not just political, it transformed society. Military power shifted permanently toward a new elite, the knightly class. Innovations like the stirrup made cavalry dominant on the battlefield, and only nobles could afford the armor, horses, and training required. This was now a warrior society, one where social status, land, and military might were inseparable. And the church, which sanctified this order, would soon rise to even greater power. But the tides began to turn in the late 10th century. A period of climatic improvement brought warmer, more stable weather. Agricultural yields increased, reducing the threat of famine. As a result, populations began to recover and expand. Simultaneously, the wave of invasions came to an end. The Vikings had begun to settle in Normandy, in the British Isles, and even in parts of Eastern Europe. They converted to Christianity, intermarried, and gradually assimilated. The Magyars were decisively defeated in 955 at the Battle of Lechfeld by Otto I, King of East Francia. Soon after, the Magyars settled in the Carpathian Basin and formed the Christian Kingdom of Hungary. In England, King Alfred the Great had already laid the foundations of unity by resisting Viking conquest. His descendants continued his work, and by the early 11th century, the Kingdom of England was formed, a centralized state with a growing administrative apparatus. In West Francia, the descendants of Charles the Bald struggled with ongoing political fragmentation. But something significant happened. The Vikings who settled in the north pledged loyalty to the Frankish crown and converted to Christianity. These settlers became known as the Normans, and they formed the Duchy of Normandy, a militarized buffer zone against further raids. In East Francia, Otto I, having crushed the Magyars, gained immense prestige. In 962, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. A new empire had emerged, German, Christian, and deeply intertwined with the papacy. Europe was no longer just surviving, it was building something new, something stronger. The turn of the millennium marked a true transformation. Around the year 1000, Europe entered a period of sustained growth and prosperity that would last nearly 3 centuries. The combination of better climate, political stability, and agricultural innovation led to the medieval agricultural revolution. New technologies like the heavy plow, horse collar, and three-field system dramatically increased food production. Vast tracts of forest were cleared for farmland. Rivers were harnessed by mills. Populations soared. As food surpluses increased, trade returned. Markets revived. Towns that had once withered began to swell with people. New towns were founded. Old Roman cities came back to life. With economic expansion came social change. A new class emerged, the burghers, or urban merchants. They challenged the feudal order by demanding autonomy from lords and founding self-governing cities, especially in Italy, Flanders, and the Rhineland. Italian cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence became major commercial hubs, dominating Mediterranean trade and connecting Europe to the wealth of the East. The rise of towns also revived education. The Church, which had preserved learning in monasteries, now sponsored the first universities: Bologna, Paris, Oxford. Logic, philosophy, law, and theology became subjects of rigorous study. This intellectual revival became known as the 12th century Renaissance, a precursor to the later explosion of creativity in the Renaissance proper. But Europe wasn't just looking inward anymore. Europe began to expand, territorially, religiously, and ideologically. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy invaded England, defeating the Anglo-Saxon King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. The result was not only a change in rulers, but a transformation of English society. Norman culture, law, and language left a lasting mark. In the Iberian Peninsula, Christian kingdoms in the north began to push southward against the Islamic caliphates that had ruled Spain for centuries. This centuries-long campaign, known as the Reconquista, slowly reclaimed territory. Norman knights also conquered southern Italy and Sicily, seizing it from Byzantine and Muslim rulers. They formed yet another powerful kingdom under papal blessing. To the east, German and Slavic settlers moved into the Baltic region and the Hungarian plain, spreading Western Christianity and European culture. But the most dramatic expansion came in 1095, when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. He urged Christian warriors to retake Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. Thousands answered the call. In 1099, Crusaders captured Jerusalem and established fragile Crusader states in the Levant. Though temporary, the Crusades symbolized Europe's growing confidence, ambition, and unity under the Catholic Church. And speaking of the Church, in the early Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was widespread but weakly organized. Local lords appointed priests and bishops, monasteries were under noble control, and the papacy held little real power beyond central Italy. But this would change dramatically in the 10th and 11th centuries with the rise of the Gregorian reform movement. These reformers, centered in Cluny and later Rome, sought to liberate the Church from secular influence, especially from kings and emperors who were choosing bishops like political pawns. One of the most determined reformers was Pope Gregory VII, who clashed with Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in what became known as the investiture controversy. The question: who had the authority to appoint bishops, the Pope or the Emperor? In one of the most symbolic moments of the medieval world, Henry IV stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside the castle of Canossa, begging Gregory for forgiveness. Though Henry eventually regained power, the long-term victory belonged to the papacy. By the 12th century, the Church had become a centralized, hierarchical power, with the Pope ruling as a kind of spiritual monarch. Church courts, canon law, and papal taxes gave it immense authority. Monastic orders, like the Cistercians and Franciscans, expanded its reach into the countryside and cities alike. The Church not only shaped Europe's spirituality, it shaped its politics, education, culture, and even warfare. In many ways, it was the first transnational institution of Europe. While the Church expanded its power, European monarchs began consolidating theirs, though not without resistance. The aristocracy, warrior nobles protected behind thick stone walls, still wielded immense local power. These lords were often wealthier, militarily stronger, and better connected than the kings they nominally served. But the Central Middle Ages saw the gradual rise of stronger monarchies. In England, the Norman kings established a centralized administration with royal courts, taxes, and records, such as the Domesday Book, completed in 1086. In France, the Capetian dynasty expanded their direct control slowly but surely, turning a minor royal domain around Paris into the foundation of the future French state. In Iberia, Christian kings grew stronger through victories in the Reconquista, while also consolidating power over the nobility. However, not all monarchies succeeded. The Holy Roman Empire, once dominant under Otto I and Frederick Barbarossa, fractured. Local princes, bishops, and city-states carved out independence, leaving the title of emperor increasingly symbolic. Despite growing royal authority, feudal customs still constrained kings. Power was based on negotiation, oaths, and land, not absolute control. But change was coming, and it came suddenly, brutally, and inescapably. In 1347, a ship docked in Sicily carrying an invisible passenger, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the Black Death. Within a few short years, the plague tore through Europe, killing an estimated one-third of the population. Entire towns were depopulated. Whole villages vanished from maps. The social, economic, and psychological shock was immense. The Church, long viewed as the guardian of souls, was unable to stop the disease. Clergy died in droves. Faith wavered. Fear and paranoia spread. But the aftermath brought unexpected consequences. With fewer people to work the land, labor became more valuable. Serfs began demanding wages. Some gained freedom. Landowners who resisted were met with peasant revolts, brutally suppressed but never forgotten. Though devastating, the plague accelerated social and economic transformation. It broke the old manorial structures, weakened the feudal order, and opened the door for technological innovation. Windmills and watermills became common. Metallurgy advanced. Spectacles, clocks, and better tools transformed daily life. And in the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg introduced the printing press, revolutionizing the spread of ideas. Out of death came rebirth. The late Middle Ages were also an era of warfare, not just between nobles, but between emerging nation-states. Gunpowder changed the game. Castles that had once stood impregnable for centuries were now shattered by cannons. Armored knights, once the elite of the battlefield, were killed by infantry with early firearms. Supporting these new armies required massive resources. Only kings could afford them. This led to the rise of centralized states. Monarchs began to assert a monopoly on violence, breaking the military power of the nobility and turning lords into royal administrators or courtly elites. In France, the seemingly endless 100 Years' War with England devastated the countryside, until a teenage girl, Joan of Arc, rallied French forces, shifting the tide of war. Her martyrdom and legend helped unify the French under a stronger crown. In Spain, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united two powerful kingdoms. Together, they conquered Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, completing the Reconquista in 1492. These events marked the emergence of modern nation-states, France, England, and Spain, governed by monarchs with professional bureaucracies, standing armies, and unified territories. But not all would join this transformation so quickly. Germany and Italy remained fragmented, caught between local rulers, powerful cities, and the remnants of imperial authority. Their unification would wait another 400 years. By the close of the 15th century, Europe had undergone a complete transformation. It had emerged from the collapse of Rome, endured centuries of invasions, survived feudal fragmentation, overcome plagues, and innovated its way out of darkness. Its people were more literate, its towns more vibrant, its kings more powerful, and its merchants more ambitious than ever before. The continent's focus turned outward. Portugal explored the coasts of Africa and opened sea routes to India. Spain, backed by the newly unified crown, turned west. In 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas, launching an age of global exploration, colonization, and cultural exchange. Some historians see 1492 as the end of the Middle Ages, the moment when Europe truly stepped onto the world stage. But the truth is more complex. What began with the collapse of an empire had become the birth of a civilization, one that would shape the course of the world for centuries to come. Europe wasn't born in peace. It was forged in collapse, refined through chaos, rebuilt through faith, ambition, and countless acts of survival. From Roman roads to Gothic cathedrals, from Crusader kingdoms to Renaissance cities, the story of medieval Europe is not one of darkness, but of endurance and transformation. And this story is far from over. If this journey through the Middle Ages helped you see history in a new light, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Explore our other videos for deep dives into history's greatest turning points. And check out the description for links to more resources and behind-the-scenes content. Europe was born in the ruins of an empire, and it built the modern world from the ashes. Thanks for watching.